Well, I made the decision not to be broken this morning. Not to break at the sight of you, or at the sight of the rising sun, or our coming together. Not to break into pieces, unable to gather them up. Because it feels like on Friday I was broken open. Now, I'm not afraid of going to pieces. I have been there. But I prefer being broken open than broken apart. I spent Friday trying to make sense of what happened in our city the night before. I spent moments in tears with sadness welling up every time someone did something kind for me. I spent Friday mourning for our city and nation and world. I know you did also. Friday started early for me, before 6 a.m., with emails from other faith leaders on our response team that I am part of at Thanksgiving Square. We started meeting last fall after the Charleston shootings to prepare for the possibility that we would be faced with a violent and horrible act here in our city. So we were, as we planned for the day, together. We continued our conversation from the night before while gunshots rang out after a peaceful protest that sought to stop violence. Gunshots at peaceful people, at people standing up for black lives, at our brothers, at our sisters, at members of our church. We started planning with the mayor to gather people at Thanksgiving Square, that locale of gratitude formed after the last big shooting downtown, the one that took Kennedy's life. The square, we said, was the only place to gather, and the mayor's office agreed. So Friday we started before 6 a.m. discussing the plans. We knew only one thing, that we needed one another. By 9:15, I was sitting in the meeting room under the spiral chapel that stands for world peace, that stands for crossing divisions, that stands for the world's faiths coming together in unity. And I was sitting there with a rabbi and a Mormon and an African-American gay Methodist and a South Dallas AME pastor. I know it sounds like the beginning of a joke. But we were there to meet with the mayor's staff, and then once the plans for the prayer service that many of you were at and many more watched on television, we turned to one another and asked, what is there to say? As a bunch of ministers and leaders and rabbis do, we turn to the meta-narrative of our time. We asked each other the name of this chapter in history that we are living through. We said it must be called something like racism, ethnocentrism, and nationalism in the midst of a violent culture. We talked about you and what you might bring to the sanctuary today, your grief and your numbness and your anger. We talked about how in the 1940s the enemy was visible across a line on a map, and since Vietnam, the decentralization of violence has increased our despair and feelings of lack of control. We talked about not allowing our culture to live in an eye for an eye way. We invoked the golden rule, and we talked about the weakness of the golden rule. And we talked about how adversity sometimes leads to peace. And we talked about the bottom line, that 6 despairing families, 5 of policemen and 1 of an Army veteran who obviously was suffering and angry, are in our midst in our city. And we asked ourselves whether seeking justice can blind us to a lasting forgiveness, And we hugged each other, and we prepared to be in the eyes of the world as we stood for unity and hope. My friend Rabbi Paley sat next to me in that meeting room, and we acknowledged that he had to speak to his people in just a handful of hours. And we wondered what he might say. He sent me his sermon last night, kindly thanking me for the companionship in that moment. In his sermon, he said, "The issues are upon us here and now. We cannot turn a blind eye nor believe that we are somehow immune to the problems out there. The problems are here." It reminds me of the words from Warsaw, which go, "Later that night, I held an atlas in my lap and ran my fingers across the whole world and whispered, 'Where does it hurt?' It answered, 'Everywhere, everywhere, everywhere.'" And my friend, the rabbi, said, "Some people are asking why God continues to allow these horrific acts. Why doesn't God do something to stop it?" I can see God looking back, he said, back at those questions in utter disbelief, saying, "Why are you asking me?" And this list of places kept coming to mind as I thought about how this violence arrives at our doors. New York City and 9/11 and Blacksburg and Fort Hood and Binghamton and Newtown and Aurora and San Bernardino and Orlando and now Dallas. This partial list of places that have seen violence crack the foundations of our communities kept ringing through my ears. I knew it didn't go far enough, though. If we add the places in the last few years where black men had been killed by police, we have Ferguson and Baltimore and Cleveland, and last week Baton Rouge and Minneapolis. And I know these events are not the same, except that they are violence taking lives. And we need to be careful not to conflate them, but know that they are places of suffering. And then I thought this violence goes back even further than 9/11. It goes to Killeen and Edmond and Oklahoma City, and then there were others. There was L.A. where Bobby Kennedy was shot, and Memphis where King was shot, and add Birmingham and Jackson, and then add the countless acts of violence we never heard of, or the few ever mourned by any of us, massacres of black communities like Tulsa and Rosewood, and then add lynchings too numerous to name, and include one that happened right here in our city 100 years ago to Alan Brooks, who was dragged and hung on an arch downtown that said, "Welcome visitors," at the corner of Main and Ackerd, so close to where the shots were fired. Some of you don't even know about Alan Brooks. And all of this made me angry, and all of this made it a little overwhelming as I reflected on all of this, part of the plot lines of this fragile American experiment. This chapter that reads violence and racism and ethnocentrism and nationalism that we are living through. And all pointing to what we need to do, what we need to strive for and yet fail at, to create peace in our cities and communities, to create hope, not marginalization, to create safety for all, to create human beings that don't see skin color as a way to discrimination or the misuse of power, to create harmony where there is strife. And all these events point to the need to counter a blame and shame culture that wants to tear itself apart and hold no one accountable and implicate the many by the actions of the few. And all these things raced through my mind as I stood behind our mayor and my faith leader friends who prayed for our city and nation. I stopped my Presbyterian colleague, Joe Clifford, before the service Friday and asked him if he needed any help with his prayer. He hugged me and looked distraught and said, "It's only the 46th Psalm. God is my refuge and my strength, a present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth be removed." And I said, "Bless you, Joe." And we stood together, our city, our people, as every speaker asked us to hold hands and to look around and see the America we strive for, and asked us to ponder how we might overcome our despair and be the city and country we dream about. They reminded us that somehow we have moved from the city of hate to the city of unity, that despite moments like this, that attempt to tear at the fabric of the unity we seek, we are free from despair because we have each other. And I sweated through my shirt and my jacket. It was so hot out there. But more important than a temporary suffering of heat was that I knew that we had made a first step toward a loving hope that crossed boundaries. That we are one blood and one family. The rest of the day I opened emails and Facebook messages and texts of love and support from around the country and wept from time to time. I didn't know exactly why those emotions ran so deep, but I did know that I was feeling a genuine love and affection from those who watched and cared for us. "We send our love to you and your congregation," they wrote, "from friends of friends and family. Blessings for your work that you do for our sake. Tell your congregation we love them." Those messages made a difference. I could feel these colleagues and friends and family reaching out saying, "We share your suffering. We know your hurt. We know you deserve happiness and peace." You see, what they were saying to us is we can't let moments like this press us from knowing that we deserve all these things. We can't let them pit ourselves against each other or have us compete for the greatest grief or who is more fearful or even who is more right. Already good colleagues and friends committed to Black Lives Matter or ending gun violence are saying things that divide us because they can't mourn for police murdered or think prayer is the answer. To which I say, right now, only prayer is the answer. There is a time to get to work, but we are in grief and shock still. And even so, we can't let people off the hook who commit crimes of bias. We can't let ourselves off the hook and fail to address head-on the disparity we see in the world, the racial tensions we participate in, the acts of privilege that condemn many people of color, and we can't stop working to end violence. One of the biggest issues in our country right now is the prevalence of automatic military-grade weapons that no civilian needs to own. I am not against gun ownership, but I'm against my neighbor being able to kill 50 people in 5 seconds. I just don't understand that. We need to talk to our leaders in our country who refuse to do anything about these weapons of mass destruction. It is not right that they sit back and do nothing. In the words of Alice Walker there, she said, there is an awful lot of anger in the world. There is a real need to be creative with it rather than destructive. I think of violence as basically useless, she said. It doesn't solve anything. The more violence you create, the more violence you have. With violence, if you create it, you're always trying to figure out why you did it or how to deal with the messiness of it, or later on, how to absolve yourself. Much better to create something, much better to talk. Love, she says, means that you have to talk, and that's where this is coming from. She says, I have seen a lot of violence, and I know that unless we address it, it is not going to go away. It's just going to grow. Now, I know invoking love in the face of real challenges can sound familiar and even naive. But we can't leave this sanctuary this morning believing that we can do nothing. We have to leave here knowing that we can create and discover meaning in our stories and make a difference in the world. We can't be victims to the seductive sins that Forest Church called the sins of sophisticated resignation and cynical chic. That to see how intractable life's problems are, we resign ourselves to them, and then in not wanting to be seen as naive, we dismiss the dreamers and the idealists as innocents, perfect epitaphs for those who confuse disappointment and despair and grief with hopelessness. We cannot commit these sins of resignation and cynical chic. Your story, my story, his story, and her story speak of a great human drama that seeks not resignation to our world, but to be part of it. To push love into every interaction, to live through compassion for each other, to work for justice. The chapter we are writing and living in, we cannot be broken by. We can despair and we can mourn, and we will still work to make the world a better place. But right now, we need to hear the hum of each other's dreams deep inside, as the poet said. We need to handle each other with care, like the parent who carries the son across the street. We need to hold each other in esteem and stand together in vigil and weep together and know that we are loved. This is our chapter. We are the characters and the plot. And God is reading this chapter, that sacred presence filling this house and our lives, waiting to see how our story will turn out. So friends, today there is only this mantra and this prayer, and it goes like this: unity, unity, unity. Love, love, love. And finally, unity, unity, unity. I love you. May God bless us all. Amen.